My endpoints have several other agents besides Tanium, so how do I get them all to play well together? Well, welcome back to Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone. So, the onboarding checklist for every new Tanium customer includes a step on the third-party agent exclusions. And most IT shops have anywhere from 5 to 15 agents running on their servers and workstations, everything from antivirus to data loss prevention. So, how can we make sure that Tanium functions well alongside those other agents? So this is the next installment in our Tanium Agent FAQ series. And back with me today is Jeff Stokes, who is uniquely qualified to address this subject. So hi, Jeff. Welcome back and tell us about your background for this topic.
Yeah, as far as background goes, Principal Escalation Engineer here at Tanium. I've been working in the OS performance troubleshooting side of things here for the past 6 years or so. Prior to that, came here from Microsoft where I was an escalation engineer for Exchange, dealing with performance and reliability, and then, on to PFE where it was a lot of, troubleshooting, debugging, performance analysis, things like that. Yeah, and antivirus quite often, even the Exchange days, would cause problems. Eating logs of the antivirus, or the antivirus part would eat the Exchange logs. Make your Exchange server crash, and those problems are still around today. Not with Exchange necessarily, but yeah, with antivirus, just in general, false positives are certainly something you need to worry about. But even more importantly, I think, is the performance impact of watching the watcher, or cross scanning between tools, things like that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it with you today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming back to the show. And I know you've got a lot of experience here, like you said. So I'm curious to just kind of baseline this. What kinds of agents have you seen common in the enterprise today as you're interacting with customers? Obviously, this is something that's been going on PCs for history, right?
Yeah,
So what's kind of like the current running total you observe, like how many agents people are running and kind of what they're doing on the endpoints?
seems like around 7 to 8, maybe more sometimes. We see Tanium, and then you'll see an antivirus product, or even sometimes two or three, depending on the shop, and then data loss prevention software, which I think you mentioned, and then also people don't think about this one, but the agent that manages whether the user can be administrator or not. I know that BeyondFrest is one of them, but or it used to
Hmm.
be. I don't know if it's been renamed now, but there's a lot of tools that will shim the user token and sort of promote you to an administrator temporarily to do something like, add a printer, or whatever it is that Windows has decided needs an administrator right. And so you can, with granular control, go in and set that right for that user. So even though they're standard, they can still do an administrative task. That's fine. But that's another agent. And then think about that. Does that agent really need to watch your operations or even your security software, to see if their tokens need to be shimmed or not? Probably not. And that's going to cause additional impact on the performance of the box, which is, it's something that people don't really think about, I guess, when they think about, something that interacts with the user like that. Certainly that plays a part. You see a covered DLP, antivirus. Sometimes we'll see things like the Citrix agent, for the user profile management, or even app layering drivers, things like that that are in there. Those are the main ones. Yeah.
So there's different kinds of exclusions. When we talk about configuring these exclusions across these different products, so they're not stepping on one another for these reasons, it sounds like the reasons are primarily agent performance, number one, but then also resource consumption on the
Resource consumption, but
box.
also reliability.
Oh, yeah.
You like we have a customer right now where we ran an uninstall to try a troubleshooting step. So we uninstalled the Tanium client, and it uninstalled us, or stopped our service, removed the service from Task Manager, even removed our driver, but left the entire directory structure because the files were being held open. And so now it's like,
Huh.
well, what do you do with that? You know,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind of
So
messy.
another agent had the Tanium directory locked during the uninstall process and it wouldn't let
Right.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
So yeah.
opened a file handle is what it's called. So it opens up a handle to do an inspection of a file object, and then sure enough, those objects, either don't get cleaned up, the file handle doesn't get cleaned up on on the objects or isn't fast enough, and so we end up leaving things behind, thinking that we're not allowed to delete them for whatever reason.
Hmm.
And that's not something that's uniquely to Tanium. That's just how Windows works. You have a file handle open and you're holding something, then yeah, no one else can mess with it. That's kind of the way it's designed.
I've been around the block a time or two, and it seems like exclusions usually come down to like a process name, an absolute path, or a relative path. Could you
Right.
speak to why those are important and maybe how different products might treat them?
Yeah. So when you look at like an antivirus product, for example, when you're excluding a process, what you're doing is saying, I don't want to inspect the activity of this process, right? And what that means is that the antivirus product is still going to inspect it because it has to. It's still going to have some sort of impact on it because you can't know not to look at something without looking at it to see whether it's okay or not, right? Generally, if you have exclusion set, that's the end of it, where it just says, okay, you're good. You have a clean bill of health. I'm going to move on and do other things. If you don't put in the exclusion for the process, what happens is the CPU load of the process being inspected actually gets increased by the activity of the antivirus agent. And that happens, like if you're looking at this in Task Manager, you wouldn't see that, say, Defender CPU was high because it was inspecting something. You would actually see like Tanium would inflate the CPU cost because our CPU load is going to go up because there's a thread in there running code from Defender, for example. So the exclusions are there partly to, sort of keep it honest, but also, just for performance of the endpoint. If the endpoint's in Azure, that's going to come into a dollar savings for CPU load. And then we talked about path exclusion. So for path, what you're looking at is, I want to exclude activity to these particular files or this directory structure, or things like that. And again, it's still going to inspect it to see whether or not it's okay or not. But at the end of the day, it's not going to do these locks that will sit there and hold the file open while it's inspected deeply, reading the header of the file or reading the contents of the file, things like that. Do we talk about AMSI yet? I don't think we have.
No, we haven't
Anti-malware
talked about
script
that.
interface. Yeah,
Hmm.
anti-malware script interface. So in Windows, AMSI is something that you don't want to turn off, but you can, but absolutely do not want to. And what AMSI is going to do is say, hey, even though you had exclusions set, what I'm going to do is scan this because it's running a script, and it's centered around JavaScript, C script, Windows scripting, and then also PowerShell. So any of those scripts that get run, AMSI is going to, sort of poke its nose in and say, I know you had an exclusion for this, but this is a script. So I'm going to look at you anyway. Right now, there's no way to sort of do granular exclusions in AMSI. It is normal to see, like, if Tanium runs, say, a VB script or a PowerShell script, it's going to be normal to see inspection activity from that. Obviously, you don't want to turn that off. That's something that's basically like the last line of defense for your antivirus to say, hey, there's a script running here. I need to look at it to make sure it's okay, you know?
You are an escalation engineer, principal escalation engineer. So these
Mm-hmm.
calls come to you, and they've probably gone through a few levels of support before they gotten to you. So how do people usually know, hey, something's not right? My agents aren't getting along.
Slow machine activity. Sometimes we'll have problems with like zombie processes where antivirus doesn't let the process close at exit. So, that age old complaint, Windows gets slower over time, gets bogged down. Where's my memory going? Why is the CPU say it's only eating 4 or 5%, but it's so slow it doesn't do anything? Those types of scenarios are things that I get involved in because it takes some sort of debugging knowledge to go in and see what's happening under the hood in those cases usually. Using like a procmon, or sometimes we'll do a memory dump with WinDBG or an ETL trace quite often for antivirus or high CPU. It's a pretty popular tool in the Microsoft ecosystem, the Windows Performance Analyzer, Windows Performance Recorder. So we use those. And those are the main ones that we leverage for diagnosing that kind of problem. But yeah, that's kind of what the anatomy of a case that comes to be is, the system's running slow, or the system's crashing for some reason, or just high resource utilization.
You actually got to the next question that I wanted to ask was what kinds of tools do you use? So you listed several there,
Hmm.
Procmon and ETLs and all that. So um, for the average IT person who's before they log this case, is there anything that they could do to begin to take a first pass using some of those tools?
Yeah, we've got a pretty good article up on our community site on Procmon, Process Monitor.
Hmm.
And I think we even provided a filter. So in Procmon, you can collect a Procmon trace and then apply a pre-made filter. So we have one that basically what it does is it goes in and says, okay, I'm going to exclude all the Tanium processes, right? I'm going to get them out of the way. Now I'm only going to filter to where the path is including the word Tanium. So I'm going to see what's happening in the registry, what's happening on the file system that is not from a Tanium process, but is in that sort of the hand in the cookie jar, if you will. And that's really easy to see. And then basically it's a question of how often does that happen? Is it happening all the time? If you see a lot of those events, that's probably pretty good indicator that either antivirus exclusions aren't applying properly. Maybe the machine's not checking into its management station that sends down the exclusions. A lot of times, if a machine can't do that and it can't do it for some amount of time, it'll default to some stricter version of exclusions, or not have any at all. Or it'll run with what it was previously configured with. But yeah, Procmon is sort of a low hanging fruit, I think, where it doesn't have a real high barrier, real tough barrier of entry, and kind of finding out what it's trying to tell you. The Windows Performance Analyzer, when DBG, obviously that takes a bit of time. It has a learning curve to it.
Yeah, I know your background of teaching some of those classes, and so it's greatly appreciated. You and a lot of your peers, our peers here at Tanium, who really are experts with those tools and who can help. I know one of the things recently that you mentioned to me was there's a new Tanium action that will collect an ETL trace.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we put into Tanium the ability to collect a performance trace using the Windows Performance Recorder, which is found in box in Windows. So if you go to, I think it's in System 32, wpr.exe is what you're looking for. And we're calling that natively in most cases with that content. So what we do is we go in and say, hey, we want you to start a trace. By default, I know if you go into the content and do an action and type in event, that's kind of the keyword for event tracing. And we have an event tracing start, stop, and then a cleanup, and I forget what the other one is, a cancel. So just in case it goes haywire, you can always cancel out the trace.
Hmm.
And then when you're done with it, it will zip the contents of that trace, the trace file, and put it into I think it's the tools directory in the Tanium client directory, and then in an enterprise or endpoint must gather EMG will gather that file along with the rest of the directory tree. So then we will have it when we can analyze it if someone's already collected the trace for us.
Boy, that's handy. So what do I get? I guess what does ETL stand for and what do I get in that?
Event trace log is ETL, and it's made from the event tracing for Windows providers in Windows. So the way I kind of explain it is you're driving down the road and you turn on the radio. There's a bunch of radio stations, right? Even if you don't have satellite radio, there's a bunch of stations. But let's say you even have satellite radio, so you've got options, right? And so each one of those is broadcasting all the time, whether or not you're listening. So event tracing for Windows is a lot like that, where these providers are sort of broadcasting in the background. And what you're doing when you tell the event tracing engine that you want to listen is you're selecting a series of channels or groups of channels, and then it's raveling all those together into memory or a file on the endpoint. And then when you stop it, it seals it all up, and you've got sort of this like an awesome mixtape, if you will, of the endpoint performance. Our default will cover CPU, disk activity, and antivirus filter driver activity. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Kind of like a DVR for all that kind of going back a little ways, to record all those
Yeah,
broadcasts. Yeah. I
yeah.
like that analogy. That really is a great analogy because people have no idea under the covers in Windows, there's so many of those logging paths
Oh
that
yeah.
are happening all the time.
Well, most of the
So
event logs, I think almost all of them are all ETL based at this point, right? They're all event trace logs really under the hood. So yeah, there's thousands of these going off every second, and the kernel's made to do that. It was made to be a very performant logging system.
Which is amazing. You think about the logging load alone just when you fire up Windows.
Yeah,
And then it does all your gaming and everything else on top of that, right? And your
yeah,
business apps. So
yep,
that's
yep.
amazing. So with these packages, then, so you have to send a package down to start Tanium Action, a package
Hmm.
that starts this and then stops it. So I just want to make sure I've got that workflow set
Yeah.
up correctly. Okay.
By default, it'll stop on its own 2 minutes. So if you send the start action, by default, it should stop on its own. If you need
Okay.
to, you can do a stop or a cleanup or a cancel or what have you, I believe. By default, it's a 2 minute trace. And you can change it. There's knobs for all this, right? So like if we say, hey, we think it's WMI, we have a WMI option in there. So it just gives you a list of checkboxes to select on what sort of logging information you think you need. But the default in probably 90% of the time is adequate. So that's what we went with, for the default action.
So then the EMG, the endpoint must gather, and internally we joke about that name, endpoint must gather, like, oh my goodness, who came up with that name? But it's
Yeah.
that's there in the client management
Mm-hmm.
interface in Tanium, so you can just go collect that from the endpoint. I remember it's been a few years ago since we released that capability, and all the TAMs in the room just stood up and cheered. I mean, this is an amazing that we can gather these logs very easily from the Tanium console now, and then you just go into your Tanium support center online and upload that, and then you'll get that file, Jeff. And then what do you
Mm-hmm.
do with it?
The endpoint must gather, we have a tool that we can mount the must gather on, analyze it internally. But for the ETL trace itself, then I would open Windows Performance Analyzer, which is actually in the Microsoft Store. So on a Windows box, you just go to the store and install it, and keeps it up to date for you. Go in and start analyzing it. And I have a template that I use in the analyzer to kind of make things a little quicker on analysis. Pre-opens a lot of windows and graphs and whatnot for me.
I'm curious with all the cases that you've handled. Could you give us just a couple examples that represent the flavor of what you see most often that people could begin to look for and even begin to anticipate themselves?
That's a good question. So I think a lot of the cases I've been working on lately have been memory footprint is one of them that I've seen come up a number of times recently. The customer is concerned because they see the number of processes that we have. They're all labeled, and it just I don't know if we covered this in our previous session, but Tanium has these processes that's essentially like one per module. And the reason we did that is so that if something were to happen on an endpoint, it would be very easy, like even in Task Manager, you can add the process command line and see, well, which module is doing this activity. And so a lot of tickets have come in recently, or at least a few, where people are concerned about the memory footprint. Now we're talking like, I think one of them I added up on, it was like 80 meg of memory. And it's like, that's really not that much.
Yeah,
What,
yeah, that's
so
not
then
much.
yeah, it turns into a conversation as to, well, is it just the number of processes you're seeing that's the problem here, or what's the dialogue? And a lot of
Hmm.
those turn into a conversation about how do you look at endpoint performance. The other ones would be high CPU load. We've had a fair number of zombie process ones, where I guess in Linux it's called defunct processes. But yeah, processes or even thread objects that are held open at close. And unfortunately, in Windows, there's no way to see that natively. There's not like a entry in Task Manager that shows you, like in like Linux, you can do top. It'll show you the defunct processes, or at least the number. And in Windows, there's no way to really see it without doing some sort of debugging. So the ETL trace that we have people collect will actually show us the count zombie processes. And so then we can go in and recommend a tool that Aaron Margosis, one of my coworkers, wrote, called Zombie Finder, and Zombie Finder will go and identify who's holding open these processes that are trying to exit at close. They're being held open by something else. That's kind of the gambit of it. Sometimes it's high storage. Usually in a virtualized environment, it'll be you get some storage complaints too, where people are doing something in Tanium without the distribute over time, right, or the VDI setting for virtualized
Hmm.
infrastructure. And so you'll end up with people that are complaining about storage running hot. And that's usually just a tuning opportunity to make sure that we're not Tanium will do things really fast. We're really good at it. We do things really quickly. And sometimes you have to slow it down for the infrastructure to be able to handle it. And in virtualized infrastructure, that's usually the case. It's not a shell game, but in a way it is. You're taking this bare metal hardware and you're stuffing a bunch of machines in it, and it's not going to break even or be cost effective if you're not stuffing a lot of endpoints in it. It's all about density. And so the impact where people see us or see their storage impact, it's where density is high, right?
Yeah, that's a good teaser because we've got another episode coming here where we're going to talk just about the virtual infrastructure considerations for Tanium.
Yeah.
So, with all the support that you've done in this area, you there's lots of tools available, lots of education customers can do for themselves. What are some of the recommendations you would have for customers to make sure that their third-party agents are all playing well together?
It's hard to recommend getting an ETL trace with Windows Performance Recorder just because the learning curve on it is pretty high. Um, it takes an investment of time to really open that up and see what you're looking at. The process monitor, it's probably a good way to do it, but also just going over the settings and making sure that when the last time the agent updated, it didn't change everything. Yeah, process monitor is probably the better way to do it. And then also, you can see the presence of your filter drivers. A lot of times people want to install a product to sort of troubleshoot, right? And if you uninstall an antivirus agent, it doesn't necessarily remove the driver. It's supposed to, but it doesn't necessarily do it. And if you stop the antivirus agent, it's probably not unloading the driver because that's something that would happen in the kernel and can be a little risky. So you can use the utility in Windows FLTMC, Filt Manager Control, I guess. Not really sure what that one stands for, but yeah. So FiltMC will actually show you the altitude and where what drivers you have loaded in the filter stack, which is where most of the antivirus activity happens, is in the I/O. When programs are accessing file objects or network activity, things like that.
So if
Yeah.
I'm a brand new Tanium customer or I'm doing a POC with Tanium, what are some of the resources we have to help make sure people are putting in the proper exclusions to make sure that Tanium's
Yeah.
not getting monitored?
So on our community site, we've got a list of how to add exclusions based on the antivirus product. That's probably the number one go-to, I would say, to make sure that everything gets set up properly, is to go in and review the article for your chosen antivirus vendor and just make sure everything's working. And then if you have MDE, of course, we have in Enforce. If you have the Enforce module, there's a one-click button that will basically add the exclusions for Defender with just a click of a button and issuing an action. So yeah.
Sounds like there's a lot of resources here. So number one, like you said, there's the docs. So you can go out there and you'll see a list. Here's all the exclusions. And some of those docs articles even have like just your basic Tanium client platform getting started guide out there. And it's
Mhm.
got even a CSV file that you can download of all those exclusions.
Right.
Earlier you mentioned this KB on Procmon. That might be interesting for folks to read. And so
Yep.
we'll have links to all these in the show notes below. Is a KB article for every popular virus product, antivirus product out there on how to make sure
Hmm.
you've configured the exclusions correctly there. And then taking a look at the docs for the Enforce module, which automatically has some built-in Microsoft Defender for endpoint exclusions. Well,
That's
that's
right.
good. Yeah. So Jeff, we've covered a lot of ground here. The time has flown by. Anything else as we wrap up?
The only thing I can really think of is, don't be afraid to engage support if you think there's a problem. We're happy to walk through things, show if it is us or if it's not us. If it is us, we definitely want to know if we're causing a problem in an environment so we can help you remediate and be a happy customer. Is it a bug? Is it a configuration problem or opportunity? Is it something that can just be tuned? Or is it something that we're just doing flat out wrong? I mean, we keep an open mind and support. So yeah, don't be afraid to open a case. Don't be a stranger.
I've seen this in my own customer support experience where there's like, yeah, we did put in the exclusions. And then they added another module maybe that
Yeah,
had some more executables associated with it and the tooling that went down, and they didn't add exclusions for that particular module. So there's this is it's a fundamental
It
but there's a
is.
lot to this fundamental,
There
making sure
is.
you've got all the exclusions in there. So even if you've already added the exclusions and you're seeing a problem, don't hesitate, like Jeff said, to open a case,
Yeah.
because it might just be one path or one executable somehow that got missed. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of Tanium Tech Talks. And this is one of many here in the installments of the Tanium Agent FAQ series. We've got more coming, and be sure to check out in the show notes below those links to these helpful articles. And as always, as Jeff said, we're here with Tanium with support to help you if you've got issues where you're finding that your agent seems like they're not getting along. We can help you out with that. So until next time, Go Tanium.
Go team.